When the people of Dusty Creek hired Nathaniel Stormwind to end their devastating drought, they expected rain within days. Instead, the drought got worse. For 3 months, not a single drop fell, while neighboring towns enjoyed abundant rainfall. What the desperate townspeople didn't know was that their rain caller was deliberately withholding the storms, and his drought was the only thing standing between them and a fate far worse than thirst. But to understand how a man gifted with the power to control weather became the most hated and misunderstood hero in Colorado territory, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a summer day in 1847, when young Nathaniel first learned that some gifts come with prices too terrible to imagine, and some storms are more dangerous than the drought they're meant to end. Nathaniel Stormwind was born in 1820 to a family of Scottish immigrants who had settled in the remote mountains of western Pennsylvania, carrying with them ancient knowledge that most of the modern world had forgotten. His grandfather, Hamish Stormwind, was what the locals called a weather worker, a man who understood the old ways of reading clouds, feeling the pressure in his bones, and occasionally, when the need was great enough, calling rain from reluctant skies. The gift, as Hamish explained it to his young grandson, wasn't magic in the way that most people understood such things. It was more like a deep conversation with forces that existed beyond human comprehension, atmospheric pressures, electromagnetic fields, and the subtle energies that connected all living things to the great cycles of nature. A true weather worker didn't command the storms. He negotiated with them, offering something of himself in exchange for their cooperation. But every negotiation had terms, and every gift from nature came with obligations that could span generations. Nathaniel's education in the weather arts began when he was 7 years old, on a day when the family's crops were withering under an unusually harsh summer sun. Hamish took the boy to a clearing in the woods where ancient stones had been arranged in patterns that seemed to hum with invisible energy. There, surrounded by symbols carved in rock and earth, the old man began to teach his grandson the first lessons in calling rain. "The sky speaks to those who know how to listen," Hamish said, his weathered hands moving in precise gestures that seemed to make the air itself respond. But hearing the sky is only half the skill. The other half is understanding what it's trying to tell you and knowing when it's better to stay silent than to speak. The lesson that followed would haunt Nathaniel for the rest of his life. As Hamish demonstrated the techniques for gathering moisture from the air and coaxing clouds from the horizon, he also revealed the terrible responsibility that came with such power. Weather workers weren't just calling rain. They were shifting the balance of natural forces across vast regions, potentially bringing drought to some areas in order to bring relief to others. Every drop of rain that falls where you call it is a drop that doesn't fall somewhere else, Hamish explained as clouds began to gather overhead in response to his ritual. Every storm you bring to end one community's suffering might be the storm that would have saved another community from disaster. The weather worker's burden is knowing that every choice affects the lives of people you'll never meet, in ways you'll never fully understand. But the most disturbing lesson came when Hamish revealed the true price of weather working. The power to influence atmospheric forces came from forming a connection with entities that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception, beings that ancient peoples had called spirits, demons, or gods, depending on their cultural understanding. These entities were willing to help human weather workers, but their assistance always came with a cost that went far beyond the physical and mental energy required to perform the rituals. "They feed on strong emotions," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a whisper as the first raindrops began to fall. "Fear, desperation, hope, despair. The more intense the feelings of the people you're helping, the more the entities are attracted to the area. And once they arrive, they don't always leave when the weather work is finished." The implications of this revelation were staggering and terrifying. Weather workers weren't just calling rain. They were potentially opening doorways for supernatural predators that could influence human behavior, corrupt souls, and transform entire communities in ways that were far more destructive than any natural disaster. Nathaniel's formal training continued for 10 years under his grandfather's guidance, but the knowledge came with increasingly disturbing insights into the true nature of weather work and the entities that made it possible. He learned to recognize the signs of supernatural influence, unusual behavior patterns in communities where he had worked, unexplained outbreaks of violence or madness, and the gradual corruption of moral and social bonds that held societies together. Most troubling of all, he discovered that the entities attracted by weather work were particularly drawn to communities that were already suffering, desperate, or vulnerable. The very act of calling rain to help drought-stricken towns could potentially expose those communities to forms of harm that were far more devastating than the natural disasters they were trying to avoid. By the time Hamish died in 1857, Nathaniel had become one of the most skilled weather workers in North America, but he was also one of the most reluctant. He had seen too many communities transformed by supernatural influences that followed in the wake of successful rain calling, and he understood that his gift came with moral responsibilities that extended far beyond simply ending droughts. The decision to travel west came in 1858, when reports began reaching Nathaniel about severe drought conditions throughout Colorado Territory and the desperate need for anyone who could bring relief to struggling frontier communities. The rational part of his mind knew that using his abilities would inevitably attract the attention of entities that could corrupt and destroy the very people he was trying to help. But the humanitarian part of his conscience couldn't ignore the suffering of families whose crops were failing and whose children were dying of thirst. Nathaniel's first assignment as a professional rain caller came in the spring of 1859, when the town of Cedar Falls hired him to end a drought that had been devastating their agricultural community for over 8 months. The townspeople were desperate, and their emotional intensity was exactly the kind of psychic energy that attracted the supernatural entities that Nathaniel feared most. But he had developed techniques for minimizing the risks associated with weather work, and he hoped that careful preparation and precise control over his rituals could bring rain without opening doorways for supernatural corruption. The rain-calling ceremony that Nathaniel performed in Cedar Falls was a masterpiece of weather working, bringing 3 days of steady precipitation that ended the drought and saved the community's agricultural economy. But within weeks of the successful ceremony, strange things began happening in the town that confirmed Nathaniel's worst fears about the entities that his work had attracted. The first signs were subtle: an increase in arguments and disputes between neighbors, unusual outbreaks of violence in the local saloon, and a general atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that seemed to infect every social interaction. Then came more obvious manifestations: reports of strange lights moving through the streets at night, unexplained sounds coming from empty buildings, and animals behaving in ways that suggested the presence of something unnatural. Most disturbing of all were the changes in the people themselves. Children began experiencing nightmares that seemed too vivid and detailed to be natural. Adults started making decisions that were completely out of character, abandoning families, committing crimes, or simply disappearing without explanation. The town that Nathaniel had saved from drought was slowly being destroyed by forces that were far more insidious than any natural disaster. The pattern repeated itself in every community where Nathaniel performed weather work during his first 2 years as a professional rain caller. He would successfully end droughts and bring relief to suffering communities, but the supernatural entities attracted by his rituals would inevitably begin corrupting the towns and destroying the lives of the very people he had tried to help. By 1861, Nathaniel had begun to develop a reputation as a rain caller whose work was followed by mysterious tragedies and unexplained disasters. Community leaders started to whisper that hiring Nathaniel Stormwind might solve their immediate weather problems, but would ultimately bring even greater misfortune to their towns. The crisis that would transform Nathaniel's approach to weather work came in the summer of 1863, when he was hired by the town of Millbrook to end a drought that had been devastating their community for over a year. The townspeople were not just desperate. They were on the verge of complete social and economic collapse, with families abandoning their homes and businesses closing due to the lack of water. Nathaniel knew that the intense desperation and emotional chaos in Millbrook would create perfect conditions for attracting the most dangerous supernatural entities he had ever encountered. But he also knew that refusing to help would mean allowing hundreds of innocent people to die of thirst and starvation. His solution was revolutionary and dangerous. Instead of calling rain to Millbrook, he would deliberately maintain the drought while secretly redirecting precipitation to areas around the town where it would eventually flow into Millbrook's water sources through underground streams and springs. This approach would provide the community with the water they needed while avoiding the emotional intensity and supernatural corruption that came with dramatic weather manifestations. The technique required far more skill and energy than conventional rain calling, and it meant that Nathaniel would have to accept the hatred and condemnation of people who would see him as a fraud or failure. But it also offered the possibility of helping communities without exposing them to the supernatural predators that fed on human suffering and desperation. The experiment in Millbrook was a success, but it came at a terrible personal cost. For 6 months, Nathaniel endured the anger and contempt of townspeople who believed he was taking their money while failing to provide the rain they desperately needed. He was threatened, attacked, and eventually driven out of town by a mob that blamed him for their continued suffering. But the underground water sources that Nathaniel had been secretly replenishing eventually began to restore Millbrook's wells and springs, and the community survived the drought without experiencing the supernatural corruption that had plagued other towns where he had worked. The people of Millbrook never knew that their salvation had come from the man they had driven away in disgrace. The success of the Millbrook operation convinced Nathaniel that he had found a way to use his abilities to help communities while protecting them from the entities that his weather work typically attracted. Over the following years, he refined his techniques and developed methods for providing water to drought-stricken areas through subtle manipulation of weather patterns that avoided the dramatic ceremonies and intense emotions that served as beacons for supernatural predators. But the approach required Nathaniel to accept a role as a scapegoat and pariah, someone who would be blamed for failing to provide the obvious solutions that people expected while secretly working to solve their problems in ways they couldn't see or understand. By 1871, Nathaniel had developed a reputation throughout Colorado Territory as a weather worker whose methods were unreliable and whose presence seemed to make drought conditions worse rather than better. Communities would hire him as a last resort, then drive him away when his unconventional approach failed to produce immediate results. What they didn't realize was that Nathaniel's failures were actually successes, and that his apparent incompetence was protecting them from supernatural influences that could destroy their communities far more thoroughly than any natural disaster. The most challenging test of Nathaniel's methods came in the spring of 1872, when he was hired by the town of Dusty Creek to address a drought that had been intensifying for over 18 months. The community was facing complete economic and social collapse, with crops failing, wells running dry, and families preparing to abandon their homes and businesses. But Dusty Creek presented unique challenges that would test Nathaniel's abilities to their limits. The town sat at the center of a network of underground geological formations that seemed to amplify supernatural influences, and the community's history included several incidents that suggested previous exposure to entities similar to those attracted by weather work. Most concerning of all, Nathaniel's preliminary investigations revealed that a group of people in Dusty Creek had been experimenting with occult practices and attempting to contact supernatural entities on their own. Their amateur efforts had created conditions that were far more dangerous than anything Nathaniel had previously encountered, and he realized that any weather work in the area could potentially trigger a supernatural catastrophe that would make his previous concerns seem trivial. The situation required Nathaniel to not only maintain the drought, but to actively intensify it, using his weather-working abilities to create a psychic barrier that would prevent the entities already attracted to Dusty Creek from manifesting fully in the physical world. The drought wasn't just protecting the community from supernatural corruption. It was containing forces that had already been unleashed by the townspeople's own reckless experimentation. But maintaining such an intensive protective barrier required enormous amounts of energy and created side effects that made the drought far more severe than anything the region had experienced in recorded history. Nathaniel was forced to watch as the community he was trying to protect began to suffer from water shortages that threatened to drive them away or kill them outright. The moral complexity of the situation was agonizing. By maintaining the drought, Nathaniel was protecting the people of Dusty Creek from supernatural influences that could corrupt their souls and destroy their humanity. But the physical suffering caused by his protective measures was becoming severe enough to threaten their lives and livelihoods. The crisis came to a head in July 1872, when several children in Dusty Creek became seriously ill from dehydration, and the town's leaders began organizing a lynch mob to punish the rain caller, who seemed to be making their situation worse rather than better. Nathaniel was faced with an impossible choice: break the protective barrier and allow supernatural entities to manifest in Dusty Creek, or maintain the drought and risk being killed by the very people he was trying to protect. His decision revealed the true measure of his courage and commitment to protecting innocent people from forces they couldn't understand. Rather than defending himself or explaining the true nature of the situation, Nathaniel chose to intensify his efforts to contain the supernatural influences in Dusty Creek, while finding ways to provide the community with water that wouldn't compromise the protective barrier he had created. Working in secret during the nights when the townspeople were sleeping, Nathaniel began using his weather-working abilities to redirect underground water sources and create hidden springs that could supply Dusty Creek with the water they needed without triggering the supernatural manifestations that direct rain calling would have caused. The process required him to work at the limits of his abilities for weeks at a time, gradually building a network of underground water sources that could sustain the community while maintaining the atmospheric conditions that kept dangerous entities from fully materializing in the physical world. But the effort was taking a terrible toll on Nathaniel's health and sanity. The constant strain of maintaining protective barriers while redirecting natural water sources was exhausting his mental and physical reserves, and the isolation of working alone while being hated by the people he was trying to protect was driving him toward a psychological breaking point. The resolution came in August 1872, when Nathaniel's underground water redirection finally began to show results. Wells that had been dry for months suddenly began producing clean, fresh water, and springs appeared in locations where none had existed before. The people of Dusty Creek finally had access to the water they needed to survive the drought, even though the skies remained cloudless and the official drought continued. But the success of Nathaniel's water redirection had an unexpected consequence that would change everything. As the community's immediate water crisis eased, the desperation and intense emotions that had been feeding the supernatural entities began to diminish. The reduction in psychic energy made it possible for Nathaniel to gradually weaken the protective barriers he had been maintaining. And for the first time in months, he could consider the possibility of allowing normal weather patterns to return to the area. The decision to finally bring rain to Dusty Creek required careful planning and precise timing. Nathaniel needed to ensure that the supernatural entities that had been attracted to the area were completely neutralized before he called storms that could potentially reopen doorways for their return. The rain-calling ceremony that Nathaniel performed in September 1872 was unlike anything he had ever attempted before. Instead of the dramatic rituals that characterize conventional weatherwork, he used subtle techniques that gradually coaxed moisture from the atmosphere without creating the intense emotional responses that typically attracted supernatural attention. The process took 3 days and nights of continuous work, with Nathaniel carefully building cloud formations and atmospheric pressure systems that would bring steady, gentle precipitation to Dusty Creek and the surrounding region. The rain that finally fell was exactly what the community needed, enough to restore their agricultural economy and replenish their natural water sources, but delivered in a way that avoided the supernatural complications that had plagued his previous weather work. The success of the Dusty Creek operation marked a turning point in Nathaniel's career as a weather worker. He had finally developed techniques that allowed him to help drought-stricken communities without exposing them to the supernatural dangers that had made his gift feel more like a curse than a blessing. But the success came at a price that would define the rest of his life. The people of Dusty Creek never learned the true reason for the extended drought or the heroic efforts that Nathaniel had made to protect them from forces they couldn't see or understand. To them, he remained the rain caller who had taken their money and failed to provide the immediate relief they had expected, and his eventual success was attributed to luck or coincidence rather than skill. Over the following years, Nathaniel continued to use his refined techniques to help communities throughout the Western Territories, but he was forced to accept a reputation as an unreliable weather worker whose methods were unorthodox and whose results were unpredictable. The reality was that his work had become more effective than ever, but the subtlety of his approach made it invisible to the people he was helping. The loneliness and misunderstanding that characterized Nathaniel's later career were perhaps the heaviest burdens he had to bear. He was saving communities from both natural disasters and supernatural corruption, but his methods required him to be seen as a failure and a fraud by the very people whose lives he was protecting. The final chapter of Nathaniel's career came in 1885, when he was asked to address a series of severe droughts that were affecting multiple communities throughout Colorado Territory. The situation was complicated by the fact that several different weather workers had been hired by competing towns, and their uncoordinated efforts were creating atmospheric disturbances that threatened to attract supernatural entities on a scale that Nathaniel had never encountered before. His solution was to coordinate a territory-wide weather-working operation that would stabilize atmospheric conditions across the entire region, while providing each community with the precipitation they needed. The project required him to work with other weather workers for the first time in his career, sharing his techniques and knowledge with people who had previously viewed him as a competitor or fraud. The collaboration revealed that Nathaniel's understanding of the supernatural aspects of weather work was far more advanced than that of his colleagues, and his methods for protecting communities from entity corruption were revolutionary innovations that other weather workers had never imagined. For the first time in decades, he found himself working with people who understood and appreciated the true complexity of his abilities. The territory-wide weather-working operation was a complete success, bringing relief to dozens of drought-stricken communities while avoiding the supernatural complications that had plagued individual weather-working efforts. More importantly, the collaboration established a network of weather workers who could coordinate their efforts and share techniques for minimizing the risks associated with their abilities. But the success of the operation marked the end of Nathaniel's active career. The strain of coordinating such a massive weather-working effort had exhausted his physical and mental reserves, and he was forced to admit that his abilities were diminishing with age. At 65 years old, he was no longer capable of the intensive work required to maintain protective barriers while manipulating atmospheric conditions across vast regions. Nathaniel Stormwind spent his final years training a new generation of weather workers in the techniques he had developed for protecting communities from the supernatural side effects of their abilities. His methods became the foundation for a more ethical and responsible approach to weatherwork that balanced the immediate needs of drought-stricken communities with the long-term protection of their spiritual and psychological well-being. He died peacefully in 1893 at the age of 73, surrounded by students and colleagues who finally understood and appreciated the sacrifices he had made throughout his career. His funeral was attended by representatives from dozens of communities throughout the Western Territories, towns that had survived droughts, floods, and supernatural threats because of his work, even though most of their residents never knew the true source of their salvation. The legacy that Nathaniel left behind was complex and multi-layered. On one level, he was remembered as an innovative weather worker who had developed new techniques for drought relief that were safer and more effective than traditional methods. On another level, he was recognized as a pioneer in understanding the spiritual and psychological aspects of weather work and the importance of protecting communities from supernatural influences that could be more destructive than any natural disaster. But perhaps most importantly, Nathaniel's story became a reminder that true heroism often requires accepting misunderstanding and condemnation from the very people being helped. His willingness to be seen as a failure and a fraud, while secretly working to protect communities from dangers they couldn't perceive, made him one of the most effective protectors of innocent people in the history of the American frontier. The techniques that Nathaniel developed for subtle weather work continued to be used by trained practitioners for decades after his death. But the supernatural aspects of his methods were eventually forgotten as scientific understanding of meteorology advanced, and the old knowledge of entity corruption was dismissed as superstition. Modern meteorologists who have studied historical records of weather patterns in Colorado Territory during the 1870s and 1880s have noted unusual atmospheric phenomena that seem to suggest some form of artificial weather control, but they have no framework for understanding the spiritual and supernatural dimensions of what Nathaniel accomplished. The communities that benefited from Nathaniel's work experienced unusually low rates of violence, social disruption, and psychological disorders compared to other frontier towns of the same period. Some historians have suggested that this was due to the stability and prosperity that came from reliable water supplies, but they have never considered the possibility that Nathaniel's protective work had shielded these communities from supernatural influences that affected other areas. In the end, Nathaniel Stormwind's greatest achievement was not his mastery of weatherworking techniques, but his recognition that some gifts come with responsibilities that extend far beyond their obvious applications. His understanding that calling rain could attract entities that would corrupt and destroy the people he was trying to help led him to develop methods that protected communities on multiple levels simultaneously. The rain caller who brought drought instead of precipitation had indeed been working weather magic, but his true miracle was not the water he provided. It was the evil he prevented from manifesting in the physical world. His droughts had been protective barriers, and his failures had been his greatest successes. The people of Dusty Creek and dozens of other communities never knew that their salvation had come from a man they had despised and rejected. But in the quiet moments when families gathered around their dinner tables, when children played safely in the streets, and when neighbors helped each other through difficult times, they were experiencing the invisible legacy of Nathaniel Stormwind's greatest weather-working achievement, the storm he had chosen not to call, and the peace he had protected by keeping the skies clear. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of hidden heroism and supernatural protection, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the American frontier. In the comments below, let us know what you think about Nathaniel's choice. Was he right to withhold the rain people desperately wanted in order to protect them from dangers they couldn't see? Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking story of ordinary people who made extraordinary sacrifices to protect others in the untamed West.